Here, usually when I come to this room, Bruce is standing up here and I'm sitting out there, but tonight's different. Let me call your attention first to the program and what we propose to do tonight. I'm going to make a few short remarks, about 2 minutes worth. Then I'd like to introduce the other members of the Center for Middletown Studies. I'd like to also introduce the speakers, who will have about 5 minutes each, so we've told them to make an appropriate response. We will then have a question period in which you can address any questions you want to the speakers. We will then have a tour of the Center for Middletown Studies, which is up on the 4th floor, and which will be hosted by Dave Tambo. We can't all go up there at once, so those of us who can't make it at once can stay down here and have punch and cookies and talk with our guests. We hope the major part of our evening will be an informal interchange between yourselves and our guests, and so we plan the greater part of time to do that. So with that brief preface, I would like to welcome you all tonight. I want to say a little bit about the Center for Middletown Studies and our guests. The idea for the center is not mine. I don't claim any credit. About a year ago, John Hewitt actually thought of the idea. With some encouragement from then Provost Richard Burkhart, we proceeded. We were fortunate enough to have a very active and energetic archivist who, with John and myself, took hold of the idea. What we wanted to do was two things. We wish first to have a repository for those studies of Middletown which have already been done. It made little sense to us for people to go to Salt Lake City or to Charlottesville, Virginia, to find data about the town that was already here. So one of our objectives was to be a repository for the previous studies on Middletown, in the expectation and the hope, I guess, that future studies would want to rely on older studies. The second part of our endeavor was to collect all those materials that we considered pertinent to the study of the history of Muncie, so that the next group through would already have a database from which to start. In other words, we wish to develop a kind of urban archive, and that is what we are doing. We were lucky enough to do two things last year that we thought were rather nice, and which we will show you tonight. We located a catch of glass plate negatives, largely through the information provided us by Dave Meeks, who's sitting in the back there. And the Lilly Endowment was kind enough to give us some money to buy them. So we now have in our possession some 1,600 pictures of Muncie in the 1920s, some of which you will see tonight. We also have collected a number of other things which you will see. We have Dr. La Follette's annotated copy of Middletown, which tells all who was whom when the Lynns were here, and a number of other things. John Hewitt has done a computerized listing of all the people who were convicted of crimes in Delaware County in the 19th century. We have a copy of that, the enumeration of the crimes. We showed that at the Washington Street Festival and got some interest, people looking up their errant ancestors. Well, enough of that. I would like first to introduce the fellow members of the Committee for Middletown Studies. There are several of the committee who are not here. John Hannaford is in California. Dick Green we saw earlier tonight, but he had another compelling meeting. This despite the fact that Bill Spurgeon told him that he didn't have to go. And Bruce Gielhood has gone to a deacon's meeting, so Bruce will not be here. And Joe Tamney cannot make it. But let me introduce the remaining members. John Hewitt from Criminal Justice. Tom Sargent from Political Science. Bruce Kirkham, Friends of the Bracken Library. Bill Spurgeon, Muncie Star and Press. Let me see, who else is sitting out in the audience? Is that all of us? Well, I couldn't forget Dave because I'm going to introduce him next. Right? Dave Tambo, our archivist. Dave will now introduce Ray Supit and make some remarks about the center.
On behalf of the Center for Middletown Studies, I'd like to welcome you all on a night like tonight. I think Dwight's really said a lot of what I would have liked to have said about the center, the kinds of materials that we plan to collect at the center, materials dealing with the studies in the past about Middletown, but then also primary historical materials about Muncie. And at this point, I wanted to stress that we're not only concerned with the larger scale studies such as the Middletown 3 studies and the Black Middletown project as well. We're also interested still in those researchers doing research at a local level, local historians, family historians, people who are documenting historic structures, this sort of work. We intend to be a center which documents and preserves the record of Muncie for all types of studies. It's been brought to my attention that we have a typo in our program tonight. This is not the Alexander M. Library. This is the Alexander M. Bracken Library. I think Dwight already mentioned that following the comments tonight, we will have a reception and also an open house up in room 478 of the Bracken Library. So as you go out the back door here and take a right at the elevators, go up to the 4th floor, and it's in this end of the building. A number of the representative materials that the center is housing are on display tonight, and I think that'll give you the best idea of all of the kinds of things that we're trying to do. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Supit, the university librarian, who will say a few words on behalf of the Bracken Library.
Thank you, David. I want to say something that I never really dreamed of in the 1940s to come to Muncie, because at that time I was an undergraduate at Ohio State, and I worked in the education library in the reserve room, and I can tell you daily I have handled more the Lind studies, the Middletown and Middletown in transition across the desk to the students at that time than I can even count. And then I ended up in Muncie 20 years afterwards. That certainly was a pleasure. But one of the first occurrences when I became the university librarian at Ball State was meeting Althea Stokel. And she interested me in the Delaware County archives. And she said, I will show you where they are. And they were housed in a warehouse. And she said, what can you do? So I said, we can house them in the library. That would be the logical place. So actually, what this led to is the formation of what we today know is the Althea Stokel Delaware County Archives and Local History. And I would say that was the real nucleus that led to the creation of the Center for Middletown Studies. The substance of the collection really has already been here, but with our guests today and their contribution, we are expanding and enlarging this center so that properly this is that I really wish that Althea was with us and that she saw the reality of the Middletown Center for Middletown Studies, so that it is quite appropriate that the location of the center is associated with the Delaware County Archives and moreover in the Bracken Library. So that as a university librarian, I'm very pleased that by a long process of many years, we have come to where we are at the present time, and indeed that we have gathered the material about the Muncie and our county and adjacent local history. So it's quite appropriate to welcome you tonight in behalf of my colleagues from the library to this particular dedication tonight, and I thank you.
In case you're wondering how you got on the guest list, there are several possibilities. Bill Spurgeon provided a number of names: Bruce Geelhood, Rutledge Dennis. We all pitched in and asked people whom we wanted to see here and whom we thought might enjoy the program. Some of the people we invited were unable to come. I have a letter here that I'd like to read, actually parts of two. This is from President Jerry Anderson. I've received the invitation for the opening of the Center of Middletown Studies. Regretfully, I must be off campus on university business on November 16th to 18th and will miss the opening. You have an impressive list of guests of honors for the opening and a meritorious academic endeavor in the center. I wish you every success. We also made an attempt to get Mrs. Lynn to come. I wrote her a letter. Unfortunately, she was in the process of moving. She's been living in New York City, but she has since moved near Youngstown, Ohio, to live with her son. And the post office didn't forward my letter, and my telephone calls, as you can imagine, since I was calling New York and she was in Youngstown, didn't come through. But she wrote a nice letter and indicated that she was unable to come. She said, "I'm sorry that several deadlines prevent my accepting your invitation to speak at the opening of the center." But she did indicate that she wished us success in our endeavor. I would like at this time to introduce our new provost, Jim Cook, who may say a few words of welcome. Jim?
Dwight, I think I'll just stand right here. This is the sort of center and program that makes any provost proud. In fact, it gives him a chance to brag, and so I will a bit. We talk about teaching, scholarly productivity, and public service as being missions of Ball State University, and this center allows us to do all of those and do them very well. I already know about several occasions in which the Middletown Studies impetus has caused some very exciting teaching to go on. It's clearly stimulating research and has brought some top-flight scholars to the campus. And in terms of public service, I look around this room, I see so many different members of the Muncie community here, and clearly it has united this community and provides us a way to get together and to examine ourselves. I'm very pleased that those of you who were able to make it this night are here, and I look forward to some very fruitful associations with the center.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce our four honored guests. I would like first to introduce them and then to call on them in the order in which they were introduced to make a few remarks. Our first guest is Professor Theodore Kaplow, who is Professor of Sociology and head of the Center for the Study of Legal and Social Change. Do I have that right? At the University of Virginia, Ted Kaplow. Our second guest is Dr. Rutledge Dennis, who is at Virginia Commonwealth University and who is co-director of the Black Middletown Project. I neglected to mention that Ted is the project director of Middletown 3. The two principal co-investigators of the Middletown 3 project are Bruce Chadwick, on my left here, who is chairman of the Department of Sociology at Brigham Young University, and his cohort there, Howard Barr, who is also at Brigham Young University as a professor of sociology and director of the Family and Demographic Research Institute. So now, having identified each of them, I'll call on Ted first to make a few remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased indeed to be here. You have no idea what a happy occasion this is for us. Now we know what to do with all our files. back in the 1920s, the Chamber of Commerce had a magic Middletown slogan that the Linds had fun with. But curiously enough, it is for us, the visiting sociologists, magic Middletown. It's the most extraordinary place in its ability to reproduce what's happening in the United States. I mean, you all living here do this without knowing how you do it. But the Linds, when they selected Muncie for a variety of reasons, they had a list of about 10 reasons, none of which included the fact that Robert Lind grew up in New Albany, Indiana. But the reasons by themselves do not carry too much conviction. Average size, not too many foreign-born people, no special problems. One important reason for them was the absence of any large educational institution that would distort the cultural life of the place. But somehow or other, with a kind of infallible taste for data that I think of our distinguished predecessors as having, they managed to pick a place to represent the United States that in fact truly does, at least better than any other place I know. Many years later, my colleague at Columbia, Paul Lazarsfeld, did a computer run to determine what was statistically the most typical place in the United States. And Muncie tied with some nameless town in Michigan for centrality in the most distributions of demographic and economic and social characteristics. We have found again and again, we go through this process of inference in tracing change in the last 50 years. We don't know what the United States was like in 1924, though there are still many people living who were around then. There are many things we don't understand about the United States in 1924, but we do understand Muncie in 1924. And so we look at Muncie in 1924, and then again now. And Barr and Chadwick and I, painfully bruising our shins against our own errors, learned the golden rule: never change the wording of one of the original questions. Always ask it again, just as it was asked 55 years ago. And then we have a trend, and you'll be hearing about some of those tomorrow. We have a trend in Muncie from 1924 to now. And we can compare Muncie with the United States now. And then we infer that maybe the trend, since Muncie and the United States always resemble each other in an uncanny way, we make that great leap of inference and say very likely, not for sure, but very likely, the trend in the United States with respect to women working or family solidarity or religious practice or adjustment to blue-collar jobs, very likely the trend in the United States has been the same as the trend in Muncie, because at the one point where we can check similarity, they look the same, and where on those few points where we can match Muncie in the United States for 1924, they look the same. So that just by living here, you are performing an enormous public service for which we are terribly grateful.
I have a very good or bad task, depending upon your definition, of not having the data upon which Dr. Kaplow and the others may draw upon. When I first came here at the end of July and met a couple of black citizens of Muncie, I related what I was doing here. They said, "You are here to look at us?" And they were very, very amazed that we had come from Virginia to look at the black community. And they kept saying, "You're the first ones to even think that we're important." Well, we kept hearing this over and over again. And the one thing that stuck in our minds was that they were very much aware of the previous studies. To a great extent, they were very much aware. and they were very eager for us to become a part of the community and to look at them. That was a phrase we kept hearing over and over again. We're glad to have you here, and we're happy that you're studying us. You're looking at how we live, what we think about the world and our community. And since I've been here, this has been a continuing theme that reverberates over and over again, the joy of being looked at. As I look around the audience, I see many of the people who have been very instrumental in making the Black Middletown team feel comfortable here in terms of assisting us with our contacts, both individual-wise and organizational-wise. Many of you met Mrs. Gordon and the 8 students who came here with her the first part of the summer, and her responsibility at that time was to acquire some oral history from some of the elder citizens in Black Muncie. My major responsibility at this point has been to work with a very able graduate assistant, Aisha, or Michelle Bing, who came with me from Virginia Commonwealth University. We have been doing our newspaper scan, we've been collecting census data, doing the mapping of the demographic surveys, and now we're in the process of constructing our questionnaires. I would like to say in closing that we've had a tremendous amount of cooperation from the Black community, since that is our major concern at this point. We're looking at Black Middletown, what Blacks in Muncie think about their world, historical and present. And I think I'm going to have a very good year in Muncie, and we have an office on 8th Street, so if you have the inclination of the interest, please feel free to call us or to drop by. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a real genuine pleasure to be here to attend the opening of the Center for Middletown Studies. I was surprised as Howard and I drove over from Indianapolis to Muncie tonight, in spite of the snow and the bitter weather, the fond memories that drive elicited in us as we talked about the experiences that we had here. And I would like to say that any success that this project accomplishes to a large degree must be attributed to the people in Ball State, to the city fathers, and to the people who worked with us to accomplish the things that we did while we were here. I feel that I really owe them a professional debt, and in whatever small measure my coming here this evening, I'm grateful to do it to help discharge that debt. On a personal level, I would like to express my appreciation. My children have fond memories of the year that they spent in Muncie and the classmates that they had, and I am grateful and appreciative of their school teachers who put up with them and the neighbors who befriended us. And they provided data and input about the community that we could never have gotten from questionnaires and interviews. And I really want to thank the community for accepting us and for a really an enjoyable year that we spent here. Like Professor Capello, I want the community to realize that it does have the potential to contribute much to an understanding of American way of life. And as we massage our way through these mountains of data which we're going to leave here, there are some interesting trends and some implications, I think, that will help us understand life in America. I wish the Center its very best, and thank you for this opportunity.
Like Bruce, I'm happy to be here. Robert Lind in Middletown in Transition writes that upon returning, one felt he could walk these streets blindfolded. Upon returning today, driving along Centennial, we knew we couldn't walk them blindfolded, but we felt we could drive blindfolded. It was very much a homecoming. In some respects, the year here has been augmented by numerous trips. We feel like we know the road between here and Indianapolis as well as we know many of the roads back home where we have spent most of our lives. I have a couple of impressions I'd like to share with you. One is how far things have come as this center evidences. It was 7 years ago, going on 8, that a fugitive carpetbagger came in, stayed in a motel, went to the library in the old library building, tried to find whatever I could of studies that had been done of Middletown by Ball State University students or others in the interim since the Linz book. I remember being acutely frustrated at how those materials were scattered throughout that library, at how I had to look in various places. I had to see what the business school had turned out. I had to look at consultant reports from people who had done traffic plans. I found in the day I spent at the library helping to gather data for a proposal, a very frustrating sense that why hasn't somebody brought this stuff together so that we don't have to do it? It is, in one sense, a dream fulfilled to see a center like this one aimed at not only bringing together the materials that local students have produced, but also those produced by, hopefully, the Linz as well as the other researchers who live elsewhere. The second impression I'd like to convey, and I don't want to second guess or say things that Professor Capello wants to say tomorrow, but some of you are aware of the gist, the trend of certain of the findings that have been released to the press. I was at a professional meeting in the South this spring when the newspapers reported that there had been no change in Middletown's families. I heard colleagues in the hallways there shaking their heads and saying, it can't be. We all know that the families have changed tremendously. We read in the student newspaper, we still take newspapers from Muncie, we read some of the Ball State student journalist reactions to the no change in Middletown message. And frankly, they seemed to disbelieve a lot of it. And so I wanted to say up front, whatever the findings that end up being officially reported are, when we arrived, we fully expected to find deterioration. We fully expected to find that Middletown families were sick, 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 and that Middletown religion was dying. God was dead and the churches couldn't be far behind. Arriving on July 4th, 1976 with my family, we pulled into the Quality Inn, registered. That was a Sunday. We spent the evening watching the parade of the boats on television, parade of the ships. Do I call them ships or boats? As we registered, we asked about the 4th of July celebrations, and somebody said from behind the counter, they're not having it today. They're holding it tomorrow, the 5th. Isn't that just like Muncie? So we were prepared to find internal decay as well, a decline in civic pride, a collapse of the institutions that we, coming from departments of sociology, in my case, Columbia University and Washington State University, where we had seen student marchers and protests at the collapse of almost everything, we expected decline. And so as you read some of the findings that say, among other things, that kinship is alive and well in Middletown, that job satisfaction, at least among those who have jobs this winter, is as high as it used to be, if not higher, that the churches are as vital as they were before, that's not what we came looking for. We are surprised to find it. We did not arrive with a brief saying nothing has changed in America, and if that's what you and your lifestyle show us, we're happy to find it, but it's not what we thought we would find, and so we claim only that's what your data has showed us. Thank you very much. We're grateful that you thought to include us in this event.
So far, it's been a very successful evening. No speaker has gone over his limits, so this has been a pleasant surprise. We've now scheduled a question and answer period where if any of you have questions addressed to members, our honored guests here, we would be happy to entertain them. Whitney?
With regard to sociology, you mentioned the university.
I'm going to repeat the question while one of the panel thinks about it. This is for the recording that we're making. Your question was, what impact has the university had on the community? What areas has it not had an impact, and what is the future of the impact on the community? Is that close enough? Who's going to answer that? Ted? Yes, that's mine.
I should say at the outset that my answer will be sheer speculation and not based on data at all. But we do find that Muncie is not a college town. That is, for whatever reason, although numerically the university looms large enough, it's the largest employer and the largest concentration of population, it appears to be a society within or perhaps community within a community. And the character, for example, of Charlottesville as a place where the University of Virginia still appears to be the reason for the existence of the town, has not in any way developed here. I would hope privately that it never did. That is, it seems to me that one of the best things a university can do for its host community is to leave it alone and cultivate its own garden. But that's an entirely private viewpoint.
On the basis of some of our impressionistic family data, let me add a footnote to that, which is that the university is something that Muncie residents are proud of. We asked people, what kind of a place is Muncie to raise a family? And time again, they would say, in many ways ordinary, they'd say safer than large cities, but they would say the richness of the cultural offerings that the university provides makes up for some of these other things that might be considered negative, bland, sometimes boring. That word came through occasionally. But the university was seen as a sparkling exception, and that it provided something that the city could still be really proud of. Now, I say still because there is a sense in our findings that the pride that produced Magic Muncie, the pride that had the boostering Chamber of Commerce of the 20s, isn't here in the same fire that it was. That Muncieites are not as proud of Muncie today as they were in the mid-20s. But a shining exception to that is the pride that they take in the university and its athletics, and particularly its cultural events, as a place where they can expose their family to some of the finer things. So I would expect that whatever else happens, the future of the university would continue to be a cultural center to which the city's families could devote themselves.
I may as well give my impressions also. One of the things that I hear, of course, we haven't sent our survey questionnaires out yet, but I've been going throughout the community, visiting various organizations and talking to individuals. And the impression I get was that for the black community, Ball State is seen as a foreign agent, something that's over there, and not something that the community feels a part of. And I think that's a great concern to many black citizens. And I think it's a job for the Ball State community to work on. There is a definite sense of estrangement from that they're not here to really look at us or to help us or to bring us on board. They're there for other reasons. And of course, being a visitor here, I don't know all the dimensions of the problem, but I'm simply giving my impressions from the feedback I've gotten because I've asked the question.
Let me clarify. Are you talking about the Lynn studies, or yes? The question is, how could the Lynn studies represent America since they didn't take into account the black community? Bruce, you're going to...
Oh, I was just reaching. Well, no, your point's very well taken. That's one of the great gaps. No book does everything it ought to do. No study does. We've always thought it was a mistake tactically. And that's why very early on we began to scheme and plot. And Dr. Dennis's presence here is a result of that scheming as to how to bring the black community into the picture. It'd be nice if we could go back and study them retroactively. We can't, but we've done the next best thing, you know, in that big oral history project that Vivian Gordon has done. Perhaps some of you don't know about that. She and her 8 students interviewed people who were alive and conscious in 1924, deliberately to reconstruct the base period that we lack. In other words, we are trying to add to the Lynn's original study that missing dimension.
Next question. Okay, the question is, what elements of the data reflect the typicality of Muncie as an American city? I think that's your question. I'd like to know that too. Howard?
I think a large part of the answer to your question is that Muncie is not atypical. We've been doing analyses of the religious composition of the city and how well the churches are. And of course, Muncie is very much unlike much of the rest of the country with respect to its religious composition. There are fewer Catholics here, for example, than in the country as a whole, fewer Jews. At the same time, however, the beliefs, attitudes, and habits of religious observance, which seem to characterize the country as a whole, as we can read them in the Gallup surveys, and these Gallup surveys on religion are conducted every year, very closely parallel the trends in religious behaviors and attitudes that we can document with our few outcroppings of data from Muncie. We are not saying that Muncie is like the U.S. in every way. We are saying that it is extraordinary that in so many of its major trends, what has happened to its families, what has happened to its churches and to religious belief in it, that it uncannily parallels not what the media have told us is what has happened in America, but what a careful examination of the data show us has in fact happened. And let me just use religion for an example. We have been told that America is in the throes of a great secularization, a great desacralization. That is, America is becoming less and less religious, and that this process has been continuing for decades. Yet if you view a number of indicators, such as number of hours on television stations devoted to religious programming, volume of printed material, books, magazines, articles devoted to religious topics, or even something as mundane as number of people going to church every week, we find that in the midst of this great secular trend, when religion presumably has become out of date and old-fashioned, church attendance has either been increasing, which was the trend until about 1960, or has leveled off at a point somewhat lower than the peak in this country, but at a level that is historically unbelievably high, that is far higher than in any Western country. So the answer is we are surprised to find that what the data show us for Muncie seem to conflict with some of the media myths that we have come to believe as part of our culture, but reflect observed changes for the nation as well. So in many, many ways, this community is unlike much of the rest of the country. It's not as metropolitan as the East. It's very different than Utah. It's different from Youngstown. But its people's attitudes, behaviors, and historical patterns seem to parallel those of the nation as a whole. And we're surprised that that should be. We expected that Lynn may have chosen it because it was representative, but that somewhere it had gotten off the track. It seems not to have, and we're as surprised perhaps as you are.
Yes, Hurley?
The question is, in the 1920s, there was some talk in the Lynn's book about the X and the Y family. The question is, do individual families still have an important impact on Muncie life? Now, I think that's your question. My question. I'm correct, am I not, that the XY family didn't appear until Middletown in transition, and I think it was a kind of an afterthought. Perhaps I'm wrong in that. Bruce?
Just one quick comment. One of the research staff members that we had spent some time collecting information about the various boards of directors of corporations and other groups in Middletown. And she is not here tonight, and I can't tell you what she found, but just from coffee chat, she indicated that probably the number of influential families had increased. But my feeling is she did find a certain pattern with members from certain families serving over and over and over again on these different boards and other types of positions. But so I can't give you any more detail than that, be more specific, but my impression was that she found a certain amount of that.
I better have a shot at this question. See, what the Lynns were afraid of was that the country was feudalizing. And particularly when they came back in the 30s, rather jaundiced, as many intellectuals were, by the experience of the Depression, they thought fascism might be around the corner, really organized fascism, not lowercase fascism. And they believed that the working class was going to be permanently impoverished, and that the American dream had been discredited, really. Remember, this is 1935. Nearly a third of the population was on relief in the previous year. Not just in Middletown, in the United States. And so what they discovered, to their horror, was the emergence of an upper class. And they were afraid that this was just the beginning of the new feudalism. Well, it turned out not to be. Some of those people are still very influential, but as the studies of Dwight Hoover students have shown, among other things, they were never influential enough to get the White River cleaned up in front of their own houses. And and it's hard to dominate a place like this. The thing is too amoeboid to dominate. And besides, the pattern changed. Back in the 1920s, they had those uniformed footmen at Newport. Baronial halls were still going up here and there, and the people whose children had married into European nobility were thinking that someday it might be nice to have titles in America. All that's gone by the board. Instead of what they feared would happen, something much nicer happened. The classes, all three of them, moved much closer together, and that's one of our major findings, and that too we didn't anticipate. There are many fewer differences between classes now than there were in the 1920s, no matter how you measure it. And it's not quite as you might expect. In the first place, the distinctive upper class style of life that seemed to be developing in Middletown 50 years ago aborted. People live very well, and often very well away from Muncie too, but there no longer is a distinctive upper class. I think that's quite clear. There's no style of life you can identify that way. And then the middle class, or the business class they called it, and the working class moved much closer together, in part, something which is familiar, because the working class took on business class habits and acquired central heating and wall-to-wall carpeting and college educations for their children, but also in very large part, and more importantly, because business class families began to act more like working class families. And that's something that no one had realized, I think. It's one of the important findings of the Middletown 3 study that in many important respects, the white-collar family of 1980 resembles the blue-collar family of 1924 much more than it resembles the white-collar family of 1924. I'll give you just one instance or two, just to illustrate the point. One of the advantages of belonging to the business class in 1924 was that you could sleep later. Working class families got up at 6:30 or earlier because the factory whistles blew at 7. And offices opened at 9:30. So there was a tremendous morning sleep advantage in the white situation. Not only has that totally disappeared, but for reasons we can't quite puzzle out, white-collar families now get up about 20 minutes earlier. Winter and summer. Nobody quite knows why. To go jogging. Thank you. There's always room for more data. Another thing that has greater social significance is that about 56% of the wives of factory workers were employed full-time in 1924, and 0%, at least of Lynn's sample, of business class wives. It just wasn't done. Now, if you move to today, about 55% of factory workers' wives are employed, same percentage as then, and about 55% of business class wives. So that this rapprochement of the social classes, which by my lights, and I think in the light of the American tradition, is wholly a good thing. And Rutledge Dennis, whether he knows it or not, is going to find the same moving together of white and black lifestyles. This has occurred not by the underprivileged being lifted up to the level of the privileged, but by a real cultural interpenetration, by a merging process. And in that merging process, somehow the threat of feudalism disappeared.
Yes. All right. Let me paraphrase that question. As I understand it, in the absence of a black professional class, how do you explain the political involvement of the black community and the lack of vice in the black community? Now that's asking something you haven't.
Yeah, right. influence to impressionistic assumptions. One of the theories that we began with, theory with a small t, concerns the thick skin, thin skin idea. That is, the degree to which a smaller black population in the midst of a much larger population is influenced by that larger population. Or in the case of the thick skin, the degree to which a larger black population may be influenced or not influenced by a similar sized white population. Now, I don't know the dimensions that would be operative in your question. Since I'm new here, I fall back on that now. I don't want to answer. I don't know whether there are no cases of heroin addiction among blacks. I don't know at this point the extent of black political involvement beyond voting. I simply don't know. These are things I hope to find out. But at this point, I don't know. I know there's a Representative Hurley Goodall who's representative, but the dimensions of that election, I don't know. I do know that some studies have shown that in situations where there are smaller black population compared to white population, that the white population is less threatened in many cases. I'm not saying this is the case here, but in other studies this has been the case. One either has a black representative because the white population isn't threatened by the black population, and or the black population, though small, has organized itself to acquire allies within the white population. So there are many dimensions that we need to look at. I'm not prepared to give a final answer as to what I see at this point as the answer for this particular situation.
Other questions? Hal?
What new questions have you asked on Middletown 3 in terms of perhaps projecting forward, say another 50 years, somebody's going to do Middletown 4, and so you'd like to have some database for them to have some sort of comparison? What new sorts of questions have you asked?
The question is, what new questions were included in Middletown 3 that when the next group studies Middletown, they can use over again?
I'm glad you asked that, because we started off asking a lot of new questions and then discovered that that was the wrong strategy, because we then were not able to do our basic assignment, that it was to document social change. And so there was a concerted effort to limit the amount of new information that we asked. But obviously there are certain processes and events that are going on, technological changes that we did include information about. An obvious one is the impact of television in our lives, the computer revolution, automation. And much of the information we collected on these topics, we have no comparable data in the 20s. And hopefully they will be useful to those who do the studies in 2020 or whenever they return.
What did you find with regard to, say, television and computers or whatever?
I don't know how to answer that. And I keep thinking in terms of how life has changed, that these things have been introduced, and without any baseline information, most of our feelings about the change that they have brought have to be somewhat impressionistic. But one thing that we have done a little bit of analysis, we expected to find that as the factories became more automated, as men and women's occupations became more routine, that job satisfaction would decline. I'll never forget going to a factory here in Muncie and watching a young man working on the assembly line with a clipboard dangling from a rope tied to the ceiling that had a paperback novel. And he would read as he would work, never looked at his work. And in between, when a new piece of equipment came by that he had to load his power wrench, he would turn the page on that clipboard. And I thought, boy, this is it. We're going to find the real data that people have lower job satisfaction today than they did in the past. The LINS didn't give us much information on job satisfaction, but others in other parts of the country have, and as we've looked at and compared that data, it appears that what automation has done to a degree is to remove men from much of the dirty and dangerous work, and in a real sense has contributed some to an increase in job satisfaction. As far as television, we just really haven't pushed through that data. I don't know. I don't know what to say on that. Maybe Howard or Ted would like to comment on it.
I don't want to talk about television.
Oh, talk about television.
No. I also am glad you asked the question. I was on that first year when most of what we did was not what was in Robert and Helen Lynn's surveys. And among the things that we have produced for Middletown 4, 30 or 40 years down the road, are a very careful look at kinship in Middletown. The Lyns, in their very important chapter on things making and unmaking community solidarity, what it is that holds the community together, somehow overlooked the effect of kinship ties. There's almost nothing in either of the Middletown volumes that tells how many people have sisters living in town, or parents, or grown children. And so we did a very extensive survey on kinship. We know, among other things, that 71% of all adults in Middletown have at least one relative that they recognize also living in town. 71% of us have somebody else, cousin, brother, mother, grown child, someone. And most have many, many more, but 71% have somebody. In addition to the kinship study, we did a family role survey. The Lyns talked a little bit about, in fact, they have some beautiful quotations about how men are God's trees, women are his flowers, that kind of thing. Talking about the sex roles, men do the important political work, women run the aid societies, and they pretty much look after the cultural life. But there was a clear sexual stereotyping that the Lyns described. But no hard data, only stories, slogans, conversations, their observations. We did an entire survey on family roles. Who provides how much? Who does how much of the home repairs? I love the quotations in there where half a dozen wives out of a sample of 300 said, I hand him his Pepsi while he's working on the car. Or I stand by and hand him the hammer. Well, men still do the home repairs. We find not too much change in role stereotyping, judging Middletown against other cities where role stereotyping has been studied. But we have a base now to look at role stereotyping, sex stereotyping, 30 years down the road. You wanted to say something about a government services survey.
Oh, yes. See, there really is a difference. I mean, between now and then, in the amount of outside intrusion. One great intrusion is that glass screen that you're familiar with. The other is what we call the federal presence. We estimate more than 50% of the population of Muncie's families now depend for a significant part of their income on federal money. And that isn't just or even primarily the poor. It includes physicians, landlords, professors. It runs right up and down the social scale. And one of the puzzles is why this doesn't have more effect. The federal government is spending about $1,200 per capita directly. It was spending about $12 in 1924 every year here. Why doesn't it have more effect? Well, we have some preliminary answers to that. One thing is that nobody identifies with the juggernaut. You see, even the people who work for the Environmental Protection Agency hate bureaucrats. Even to federal employees in our survey, the federal government is they, not us, so that they don't cohere in any way. The other thing is that marvelous perhaps somewhat wrong-headed American invention of redistributing income by redistributing it to everybody more or less in proportion to the income they had before. We haven't really finished analyzing that, but we certainly will have an important basis for whoever comes along in 2020.
Yes, Dave. I think again that the researchers for Middletown 3 will corroborate my statement that indeed one of the things they found that was very encouraging was an increase in tolerance, particularly in the high school survey. Is that not true? Right. Question was, what's the relationship between Middletown 3 and Black Middletown?
None, except that the Middletown 3 Advisory Council, which is composed of half a dozen very distinguished scholars who get together once a year or so and tell us what we've done wrong. We're very much aware from the beginning of the need for a study of Black Middletown and encouraged it to happen. And when it did happen, had not the slightest desire to control it or direct it. So Dr. Dennis and Dr. Gordon are entirely on their own with respect to the direction of their study, and they don't even look to us for as much theoretical guidance as we think they could get. No, it's for better or worse, it's a venture in Black sociology, and we'll see when they publish their findings whether it was for better or worse.
I think I'll take one more question. It's awfully warm in here, and there are some things we still have to do. So maybe I'll take two quick questions, and then I'll call in the Middletown 3 about blacks.
Oh, a small amount. Nothing you could do very much with. The high school survey included some usable information about Black students because all the students in all the high schools were surveyed. But as I say, we adopted the strategy which is sort of forced on us. You understand? The way things have developed, with the growing strength and self-consciousness of the Black community, you can't send a white team in to study the Black community. It's no longer considered proper, and you can't send the Black team in. They have to do it themselves. So that's what's happening. There are in some no secret ties between the two studies, except that we thought the Black Middletown study needed doing, and we encouraged its being done, and we support it as an enterprise, and we are not sure that they will agree with us when they bring in their findings. We don't in any sense control it, and even if we wanted to, we couldn't. And I think just as a matter of practical research strategy, we have arrived at a point which I hope we will leave, where American Indians do not like to be studied except by American Indians because they have come to feel that that 100 years of being studied by white researchers was a kind of imperialism. And I think a good many Black citizens have the same feeling, that to be studied by a white sociologist is in some sense to be put down. I think that's complete nonsense, but since it is possible for very competent Black sociologists to undertake the job and do all of it, that's the way it's working out in this case. Rutledge, do you disagree with that?
Slightly, yes.
All right, disagree.
back in the 1960s, when I was a grad student, we went through the argument of, do you have to be one to study the black community? You have to be one to know one. And I was teaching mainly white students at Washington State University at the time. And if I followed the argument that I couldn't teach them, which I was very competent to do, therefore, I don't adhere strictly to the argument that one has to be a white to study a white or vice versa. However, the reality is that, and this is a very important reality, is that, as Professor Capel has mentioned, the years of racial exploitation remains a very active thing within the black population. The years of racial exploitation is a very real thing, and we have to consider these things when we anticipate or propose to study separate population bases. The other thing I'd like to mention is that often, as a black sociologist or a black scholar, it is often very difficult for us to study white people. We've only had that in the reverse. That is, the literature is full of white scholars who've gone to black communities and have studied black communities. The access by black scholars to white communities is very limited. And that's what I, as a scholar, resent. Professionally, I resent it, because it's an unequal utilization of the scholarly enterprise. Blacks are freely given information to white scholars. The books are full of them. And on several occasions, I've tried studying a white population, and no deal. And I think there are some problems there. So until the black community has access to white communities, then the black community has to be very careful of who comes to the black community.
Norm, I think I'm going to make this the last question.
Well, I really don't have a question. I have more of an announcement to make. It may not be the appropriate place to do it, but folks in this room might feel compelled to say this. The College of Sciences and Humanities, in a meeting today with the Planning Committee, looking at some 28 proposals that came toward my desk, voted as the #1 priority in planning for the next 6 years for our college the establishment of a social science research, teaching, and social services center that would have both computer hardware and software and human resources in the form of graduate assistantships, technical folks, secretaries, and so on to establish a meaningful social science research center at Ball State University, much of which, of course, will be involved with Middletown studies. I'm equally as pleased to say that the second priority in the college is the establishment of an endowed chair for Middletown studies. Can't think of a better place to make that announcement. Very good.
I think that's an appropriate place to stop. There are 4 things that we would like you to do. We would like you to go upstairs on the 4th floor at the far end, the east end of the building, take a look at some of the things we have in the Center for Middletown Studies. We would like to have you drink our punch and eat our cookies furnished by friends of the Bracken Library, Bruce Kirkham being the sponsor. We would like to have you meet informally our guests here, and tomorrow we would like to have you come down and listen to Professor Capel's speech in the Ball Corporation Auditorium. Meanwhile, you've been a very patient and a very good audience, and thank you very much for coming.